This is HOA property now, Sergeant. Per Article 7, subsection C, we have the authority to remove any non-compliant structures, and that ridiculous flagpole is first on the list. Karen's voice, a grating mix of nasal entitlement and smug satisfaction, cut through the quiet morning air like a rusty saw. She stood on the edge of my lawn, a plus-size woman in a pastel pink tracksuit that strained at the seams, brandishing a clipboard like a scepter. Behind her, two beefy men in cheap security uniforms stood with their arms crossed, their expressions a perfect blend of boredom and aggression. They were her royal guard, and my front yard was apparently her kingdom. The morning dew was still fresh on the grass, the same grass I'd been fined for last week for exceeding the 3-inch height limit by a quarter of an inch, and the American flag, the very symbol I'd worn on my uniform for 20 years, fluttered softly in the breeze, utterly oblivious to the fact that it had been declared non-compliant. I looked from the flag to her smug face to the notice she was holding out, a demand for $5,000 in accumulated fines and a final warning of foreclosure. My hand, almost of its own accord, moved from my side and twitched, an old reflex from years in situations where a calm demeanor was the only thing separating order from chaos. I felt the familiar cold anger coiling in my gut, a controlled burn I hadn't felt since my last tour. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board, or any tin pot tyrant who gets high on a little bit of authority, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and maybe share your own HOA nightmare, because believe me when I tell you that the story of how this woman's little empire came crashing down is one for the ages. You see, Karen didn't know who she was dealing with. She saw a quiet, disabled veteran who kept to himself. She saw an easy target. What she failed to understand was that a sergeant first class in the United States Army learns a few things over a 20-year career: patience, strategy, and the precise application of overwhelming force. Her mistake was thinking her rulebook was the only one that mattered. My journey to this manicured suburban battlefield began, as it so often does, with a search for peace. After 2 decades of service, with more sand in my boots and memories in my head than any man should have to carry, all I wanted was a quiet patch of green to call my own. This house, a modest single-story ranch at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, was supposed to be my sanctuary. It had a solid roof, a 2-car garage for my old Mustang, and a backyard big enough for a small garden and a grill. I bought it with the money I'd saved, signed the mountain of paperwork, and barely glanced at the thick booklet of HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. That was my first mistake. In the Army, rules have a purpose. They keep you and your men alive. I assumed civilian rules, especially for something as mundane as a neighborhood association, would be based on common sense and mutual respect. I was wrong. The first notice appeared a month after I moved in, a crisp white envelope taped to my front door. It was a warning. My trash receptacle had been visible from the street for 20 minutes, past the designated 9 a.m. collection time. The violation carried a potential fine of $25. I chuckled, tossed it in the bin, and made a mental note to be quicker on the draw next time. The next week, another notice. A patch of dandelions had been observed in my side yard. Fine, $50. Then came the letter about the color of my garden hose, the placement of my welcome mat, and the unacceptable glare from the solar-powered yard lights I'd installed along the walkway. Each letter was signed with a flourish by Karen Miller, HOA president. I'd seen her around, a large woman who drove a golf cart through the neighborhood like a patrol vehicle, her eyes scanning every lawn and window for infractions. Her reign had begun 6 months before I arrived, after a sparsely attended election, where she won by a handful of votes, promising to restore the aesthetic integrity of the community. What that meant in practice was a campaign of micromanaging harassment aimed at anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. I tried to be a good neighbor. I paid the ridiculous fines, pulled the dandelions, and bought a beige, HOA-approved garden hose. I was tired of fighting. I just wanted to be left alone. The breaking point, the line in the sand she crossed that set everything in motion, was the flagpole. It was a 20-foot residential-grade pole, nothing ostentatious. I sank it in concrete myself, exactly 3 feet from my porch, and every morning at sunrise I'd raise Old Glory. It was a ritual, a small connection to the life I'd left behind and the country I'd served. It was my right, protected by the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005, a federal law that explicitly prohibits homeowners associations from restricting the display of the American flag. The first letter from Karen called it an unapproved architectural modification. I responded with a polite, certified letter of my own, citing the specific federal statute that protected my right. Her response was to double down. The flagpole itself, she argued, was the violation. The bylaws, she claimed, superseded any federal law. The fines began at $100 a day. My quiet sanctuary was becoming a prison, and its warden was a woman armed with a clipboard and an unquenchable thirst for control. I knew then that my fight for peace was over, and a different kind of fight was about to begin. She had mistaken my desire for quiet as a weakness, my patience as compliance. She was about to learn, in excruciating detail, how disciplined, how strategic, and how utterly relentless a cornered sergeant can be. The war for the cul-de-sac had begun. The flagpole became the hill I was willing to die on, both literally and figuratively. Every morning, the sight of the flag catching the first rays of sun solidified my resolve. It wasn't just about a piece of cloth on a metal pole anymore. It was about the principle. It was about a bully who had wrapped her petty tyrannies in the guise of community rules and was systematically squeezing the life out of her neighbors. The daily fines were now accompanied by letters that grew increasingly unhinged. Karen's prose was a bizarre mix of pseudo-legal jargon and passive-aggressive threats. She wrote of flagrant disregard for community harmony and a pattern of antisocial behavior. She was building a paper trail, creating a narrative that painted me as a rogue element, a problem that needed to be surgically removed. I knew I couldn't fight her on her turf. The HOA board was stacked with her cronies, people who either owed her favors or were too intimidated to stand up to her. An internal appeal would be a kangaroo court. I needed a different strategy, one that involved reconnaissance, alliance building, and a thorough understanding of the enemy's tactics. I started taking walks in the evening, not just for the exercise, but to observe and to listen. I'd stop and chat with my neighbors while they watered their lawns or brought in their mail. At first, they were hesitant, their eyes darting nervously toward Karen's house as if she had the entire neighborhood under surveillance. But slowly, as I shared my own story of the flagpole, their own frustrations began to pour out. There was the young couple, the Garcias, who had been fined $300 because their toddler's bright blue plastic slide was visible over their 6-foot privacy fence. They were told it disrupted the natural color palette of the community. Then there was Mrs. Gable, a widow in her late 70s who had lived in her house for 40 years, long before the HOA even existed. Karen was threatening her with a lien on her home because her collection of garden gnomes was deemed tacky and excessive. Her husband had collected them, and each one held a memory. Now they were a source of terror. The most disturbing story came from Dave, a quiet software engineer who lived 2 doors down. He was a numbers guy, meticulous and detail-oriented. He'd been hit with a fine for an oil stain on his driveway the size of a quarter. When he challenged it, providing evidence that the stain was there when he bought the house, Karen had simply ignored him and started adding late fees. He told me, his voice low and angry, that he'd tried to get a copy of the HOA's annual budget and financial statements, as was his right as a homeowner. He was stonewalled at every turn. "She treats the HOA's money like her own personal slush fund," he muttered, "but proving it is another story. The records are a black box." That was the key. Her power was built on a foundation of opacity and intimidation. If we could shine a light on her operations, on the money, the whole rotten structure might just collapse. We formed a small clandestine council of the disgruntled. Myself, the Garcias, Mrs. Gable, and Dave. We met in my garage after dark, surrounded by old tool chests and the scent of motor oil, a war room for the suburban resistance. Dave, with his analytical mind, was tasked with digging into the financials. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He wouldn't ask Karen for the records again. He'd use public records requests to get information on the vendors the HOA was paying. If she was funneling money, the trail had to lead somewhere. The Garcias, who were active on community social media pages, would monitor online chatter and discreetly identify other homeowners who had been targeted. Mrs. Gable, with her long history in the neighborhood, became our institutional memory, recalling past board members and old disputes. My role was to be the lightning rod. I would continue to defy Karen, to absorb her attacks, and to document every single interaction. I bought a set of small, high-quality security cameras and positioned them to cover my entire front property. Every letter, every notice, every drive-by in her golf cart was recorded, dated, and filed away in a thick binder that I labeled Operation Overlord. The battle was no longer just about my flagpole. It was about Mrs. Gable's gnomes, the Garcia's slide, and Dave's oil stain. It was about reclaiming our homes from a petty dictator who had mistaken a three-ring binder of bylaws for a royal decree. Karen thought she was isolating me, making an example of me. But with every threatening letter she sent, she was unknowingly forging the very alliance that would become her undoing. She was so focused on the lone tree that she failed to see the forest growing around her, its roots interlocking, preparing for the storm. The tension in the neighborhood became a palpable thing, a low hum of anxiety that you could feel in the air. Karen, sensing the shift from quiet compliance to silent resistance, escalated her campaign. Her golf cart patrols became more frequent, her stare more intense. She started taking pictures, not just of my flagpole, but of everyone's property, her phone held up like a weapon. The little pink slips of violations proliferated, stuck to front doors like scarlet letters, for infractions that became more and more absurd. Mr. Henderson, 2 streets over, was fined because the decorative wreath on his door was deemed unseasonable on November 5th. The Patels were cited for having a basketball hoop in their driveway that wasn't the approved shade of black. It was a reign of terror by 1,000 paper cuts, designed to wear people down, to make them feel powerless. My binder grew thicker by the day. I documented everything with the dispassionate precision of an after-action report. Each letter from Karen was logged, scanned, and cross-referenced. The video from my security cameras captured her slow, menacing drive-bys, her theatrical inspections of my lawn, and one memorable incident where she got out of her cart to measure the height of a rose bush with a tape measure. I was building a mountain of evidence, a detailed portrait of a woman drunk on power, whose obsession had spiraled into a clear pattern of targeted harassment. Meanwhile, Dave's digital archaeology was starting to pay off. He couldn't get the HOA's books directly, but he'd discovered something interesting through public business filings. The new private security company Karen had hired, the one whose goons had been flanking her, was called Prestige Neighborhood Solutions. It was a brand new LLC formed just 3 months ago. The registered agent for the company was a man named Frank Miller. A quick search revealed Frank Miller was Karen's brother-in-law. The address listed for the business was a P.O. box. There was no website, no list of other clients. It was a shell created for the sole purpose of billing our HOA. "She's paying her family with our money," Dave said, his face grim as we reviewed the documents in my garage. "The contract she signed on behalf of the HOA is for $10,000 a month, for 2 guys to drive around a few times a day and stand behind her while she bullies people. It's blatant self-dealing and embezzlement." This was the smoking gun. Her harassment wasn't just about power, it was about profit. She was manufacturing conflict to justify the existence of a security force that was lining her own family's pockets. We now had a motive that went beyond simple megalomania. The final piece of my own preparation involved reaching out to my own network. I made a call to a man named Tom, a retired JAG officer I'd served with who now ran a small private practice. I laid out the whole situation for him, from the flagpole to the financial discoveries. He listened patiently, his silence on the other end of the line more reassuring than 1,000 platitudes. When I was finished, he let out a low whistle. "Mark," he said, "this woman is a lawsuit waiting to happen. She's not just violating the Flag Act. She's likely breaching her fiduciary duty to the HOA. The self-dealing with her brother-in-law is a slam dunk for a civil suit and possibly criminal charges." Tom advised me to continue documenting everything, but to avoid direct confrontation. "Let her build the case against herself," he said. "Tyrants like this always overreach. They can't help it. When she makes her big move, we'll be ready to bring the whole house of cards down. And so I waited. I continued my morning ritual with the flag. I politely declined to pay the ever-increasing fines. I responded to each of her certified letters with a simple, professionally written letter from my legal counsel, stating that I disputed the fines and considered her actions to be a form of illegal harassment. The knowledge that we had her cornered, even if she didn't know it yet, was a source of cold comfort. The air was electric, charged with the feeling of an impending storm. Karen was a predator circling her prey, and I was the bait in a trap she couldn't see. Her final fatal overreach was coming. We were all sure of it. All we had to do was hold the line and wait for her to make the mistake that would end her reign for good. The moment of truth arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and bright, the kind of day that feels peaceful until it isn't. It began with a loud, official-sounding knock on my door. I knew it wasn't a friendly neighbor. It was too forceful, too demanding. I glanced at the monitor for my front door camera. It was Karen, flanked by her two security goons, looking even more self-important than usual. This time she wasn't just holding a clipboard. She was holding a thick packet of papers with a formal-looking cover sheet. This was it. This was the big move Tom had predicted. I opened the door just enough to speak through the gap, leaving the chain on. "Can I help you, Karen?" I asked, my voice deliberately calm and even. Her face, already flushed with exertion and righteous fury, deepened to a shade of plum. "You can open the door, Sergeant," she sneered, putting a derisive emphasis on my old rank. "We are here on official HOA business, as you have refused to pay the 27 outstanding fines against your property, totaling $5,375. The board held an emergency vote last night. We are placing a lien on your property and beginning foreclosure proceedings." She thrust the packet of papers toward the door. Behind her, one of the goons smirked. They thought this was checkmate. They thought a piece of paper and a threat could make a man who had faced down armed insurgents break a sweat. I didn't take the papers. I looked past her, at the two men standing on my porch as if they owned it. "You are on my property, Karen. You and your employees need to leave. Now." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "We are not leaving," she snapped. "We are conducting an official inspection to document all non-compliant items for the foreclosure filing. This is HOA property now, Sergeant. Per Article 7, subsection C, we have the authority to remove any non-compliant structures, and that ridiculous flagpole is first on the list." That was the line. The direct threat not just to fine me, but to physically enter my property and dismantle something that was, to me, sacred. The cold anger in my gut, the one I kept so carefully banked, flared hot. My training, my entire career, was built on a simple principle. You establish a perimeter and you defend it. My home was my perimeter. "Karen," I said, my voice dropping low, losing all trace of neighborly politeness. "This is your final warning. You are trespassing. If you or your men take one more step onto my lawn, I will consider it a hostile act, and I will take appropriate measures to defend my home." I closed the door, the chain still in place, and locked the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I could hear her sputtering with indignation on the other side. "You can't do that. We have authority. We're calling the sheriff." I ignored her. I walked calmly from the front door, through the living room, and into my home office. My movements were deliberate, unhurried. The adrenaline was there, but it was a familiar companion, sharpening my senses rather than clouding my judgment. I picked up my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Tom, my lawyer. "She's here," I said. "She's threatening to enter the property and remove the flagpole. She's with her security guys. Go time." Tom's voice was all business. "Is law enforcement there?" "She's threatening to call them," I replied. "Good," as he said. "Let her. Do not engage. Stay inside. The trap is set, Mark. Just hold fast." My second call was to a number I hadn't dialed in years. It was the personal cell of my old commanding officer, Colonel James Peterson. He was now the garrison commander at Fort Hays, the large Army base just 30 miles down the highway. We weren't close friends, but we had shared enough miserable field exercises and high-stakes deployments to forge a bond of mutual respect. He answered on the second ring. "Peterson." "Sir, it's Mark Rylander," I said. It's been a while. There was a pause, then recognition. Rylander, good to hear your voice. Everything all right? You sound operational. I gave him the short version, the condensed brief of a year's harassment culminating in the current standoff. I focused on the key elements: a disabled veteran being harassed, federal law being ignored, and the specific repeated threats against the American flag. When I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "They're threatening to tear down your flagpole, Sergeant," the colonel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir, right now. They're on my lawn." "Stay inside your house, Mark. Lock your doors. Do not, under any circumstances, engage them. I'm handling this." The line went dead. I walked to my bedroom, to the large fireproof safe bolted to the floor in my closet. I entered the combination, the tumblers clicking softly in the quiet house. I swung the heavy door open. I wasn't going to start a firefight on my front lawn, but I would be damned if I let a pack of bullies breach my home without being prepared to defend it. My hand reached inside, my fingers brushing against the cold steel of my service pistol. I didn't draw it. I just rested my hand there. It was a promise to myself. They would not cross my threshold. Outside, Karen's voice, now amplified by a cheap megaphone, began to blare. "Mark Rylander, you are in violation. Exit the residence. The authorities are on their way." The siege had begun. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one punctuated by the distorted squawk of Karen's megaphone. She was pacing back and forth on my lawn, a frantic, furious general laying siege to a fortress of one. Her two security guards stood awkwardly behind her, looking less like enforcers and more like oversized teenagers who had been dragged into their mother's argument with the neighbors. From my living room window, partially obscured by the blinds, I had a clear view of the unfolding drama. The sight was so absurd it was almost comical. Here was a woman in a powder blue tracksuit, bellowing about bylaws and fines, trying to intimidate a man who had spent years in places where the only rules were the laws of survival. The promised sheriff's deputy arrived about 15 minutes later, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He pulled his cruiser up to the curb and got out slowly, his expression one of weary resignation. This was clearly not the high-stakes call he'd been hoping for. Karen descended on him like a hawk on a field mouse, clipboard in hand, launching into a rapid-fire tirade about my insubordination, the illegal flagpole, the mountain of unpaid fines, and my threatening behavior. The deputy listened patiently, nodding in all the right places, his eyes occasionally flicking toward my house. He was doing his job, trying to de-escalate, but he was walking into a situation that had been engineered by a master manipulator. He approached my front door and knocked. "Sir, this is Deputy Miller with the county sheriff's office. Could you step outside so we can talk for a minute?" I remained where I was. I knew my rights. I did not have to exit my home. I did not have to speak with him without my lawyer present. Tom's advice was clear: do not engage. Let her dig her own grave. "I'm on the phone with my attorney," I called out through the door, my voice loud and clear. "He has advised me not to come out. Your issue is with the HOA president, who is currently trespassing on my property." This was a calculated move. It immediately framed the situation not as me being the problem, but Karen. It also informed the deputy that I was not some unhinged recluse, but someone who had already sought legal counsel. I saw the deputy's shoulders slump slightly. This was no longer a simple dispute. It was a legal quagmire. He turned back to Karen, and I could see them engaged in a heated conversation. Her arms were waving, her face contorted with rage. She was pointing at my house, at the flagpole, at the deputy's own chest. She was accustomed to getting her way, and the deputy's reluctance to kick down my door and drag me out in chains was a direct affront to her authority. This was the critical moment. If the deputy caved to her pressure, things could get ugly fast. But if he held the line, her power would be exposed for what it was: a complete illusion. While the drama unfolded on my lawn, Dave, my data analyst neighbor, was executing his part of the plan. He started a group text with our small alliance and a few other neighbors he'd identified as friendly. "Go outside, Rowler," he wrote, "but don't engage. Just watch and record." One by one, front doors opened. People emerged onto their porches, phones in hand. Mrs. Gable sat in a lawn chair in her driveway, a silent, stoic observer. The Garcias stood on their porch, their toddler peeking out from behind his father's legs. The audience was gathering. Karen's private war was about to become a public spectacle, and she was too consumed by her own fury to even notice. She was losing control, and it was making her reckless. In her megaphone-fueled rant to the deputy, I could hear her escalating her claims. He threatened us. He went inside to get a gun. He's a menace to this community. It was a lie, but a dangerous one. It was the kind of accusation that could get a man killed. I felt a surge of ice-cold fury. This woman wasn't just a bully. She was malicious. She was willing to risk my life to win an argument about a flagpole. My hand, which had been resting on the edge of the safe, clenched into a fist. All my training, all my discipline, was focused on one thing: holding steady. The trap was laid. The players were in position. Now we were just waiting for the cavalry. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that my cavalry was on its way. The quiet hum of an engine, different from the deputy's cruiser, began to grow in the distance. It wasn't the sound of a civilian vehicle. It was deeper, more powerful. It was a sound I knew well. It was the sound of authority. The two vehicles that turned onto my quiet cul-de-sac moved with a silent, imposing efficiency that made the local sheriff's cruiser look like a toy. They were dark green, military-spec SUVs, the kind you see on a base, not in a suburban housing development. On the side of each door was the crisp white lettering: Military Police. They didn't park haphazardly at the curb. They pulled up and stopped in the middle of the street, perfectly aligned, flanking the deputy's car, and effectively blocking the only way in or out. The street fell silent. Karen's megaphone squawked once, and then died as she stared, her mouth agape. The neighbors on their porches lowered their phones slightly, a collective sense of shock rippling through the small crowd. The passenger door of the lead vehicle opened, and out stepped a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Colonel James Peterson was in his full Class A uniform, the chest laden with ribbons telling the story of a long and distinguished career. He was tall, ramrod straight, with the kind of steely gaze that could make a general nervous. He adjusted his service cap, his movements economical and precise, and then surveyed the scene. Karen and her goons on my lawn, the flustered deputy, and the ring of curious neighbors. Behind him, two armed military police officers, young, fit, and stone-faced, exited the vehicles and took up positions, their hands resting near their sidearms. They weren't aggressive, but their presence was an undeniable statement of purpose. The deputy, to his credit, recognized the shift in the universe immediately. He was no longer dealing with a crazy HOA lady. He was standing in the middle of a jurisdictional event that was far above his pay grade. He straightened his own uniform and walked tentatively toward the colonel. "Sir," he began, "I'm Deputy Miller, County Sheriff's Office. We had a call about a disturbance." Colonel Peterson didn't look at him. His eyes were locked on Karen. He walked past the deputy as if he weren't there, his polished boots making no sound on the asphalt, and stopped directly in front of her on the public sidewalk, just inches from my property line. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of command. "I am Colonel James Peterson, Garrison Commander of Fort Hays. I'm told you are the president of this homeowners association." Karen, momentarily stunned into silence, seemed to regain her footing. She puffed out her chest, trying to reclaim her lost authority. "I am," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And this man," she pointed a sausage-like finger at my house, "is a dangerous individual who is violating numerous community bylaws and has threatened my staff." The colonel's gaze didn't waver. "He is also Sergeant First Class Mark Rylander, retired," he said, his voice dropping a few degrees. "A decorated combat veteran who served this country for 20 years. I am further informed that you and your staff have been engaged in a prolonged campaign of harassment against him, culminating in your trespassing on his private property today to make threats against a federally protected symbol, the flag of the United States." He gestured with his chin toward my flagpole, where the stars and stripes still fluttered in the breeze. Karen's face went pale. The legalistic jargon of her bylaws suddenly sounded flimsy and pathetic against the colonel's cold, hard statement of fact. It's, it's an unapproved structure, she stammered. The rules. The rules? The colonel interrupted, taking a single deliberate step forward. Let's talk about the rules. Let's talk about United States Code, Title 4, Chapter 1, which states that no homeowners association can restrict a person's right to display the American flag. That's a federal law, ma'am. It doesn't get superseded by your little neighborhood rulebook. He turned his head slightly, finally acknowledging the sheriff's deputy. Deputy, are you aware that these individuals are attempting to enforce a civil covenant that is in direct violation of federal law? The deputy looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Sir, I was just responding to a disturbance call. The disturbance, the colonel said, his voice like chips of ice, is a civilian attempting to deprive a military veteran of his civil rights under color of authority. That can be a very serious federal offense. My MPs are here to observe and document any potential crimes being committed against a former member of the armed forces. He turned back to Karen. Her two security guards had taken several involuntary steps backward and were trying to blend in with the azalea bushes. I want your name, the colonel commanded, and the names of your employees, and the name of your security company. Karen just stared at him, her entire world collapsing. The power she had wielded with such glee, the power of fines and liens and threats, had just slammed into a brick wall of actual, legitimate authority. The clipboard slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the grass with a soft thud. The war for the cul-de-sac was over. She just didn't know the terms of her surrender yet. The arrival of Colonel Peterson and the military police was like hitting a pause button on reality. The chaotic, shrill energy of Karen's siege evaporated, replaced by a tense, formal silence. The neighbors, who had been recording the spectacle with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity, now watched with open-mouthed awe. This was better than any reality TV show. This was justice, arriving in a dark green SUV. The colonel was a master of psychological warfare. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority was absolute, radiating from his uniform, his posture, and the cold, unwavering certainty in his eyes. He had Karen completely disarmed, her primary weapons, bluster and intimidation, rendered utterly useless. One of the MPs, a young sergeant with a notepad and a body camera, began the process of documentation. He approached the deputy first, professionally and respectfully. Deputy, for our report, can we get your name and badge number and a copy of the initial dispatch call? The deputy, eager to be seen as cooperative, complied immediately. He was no longer part of Karen's posse. He was a witness in a federal inquiry. The MP then turned to Karen's security goons, who were now trying to look as non-threatening as possible. Your names and your security license numbers, please. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, mumbled, We don't need a license, just for observation. The MP's expression didn't change, but his voice hardened slightly. You are representing yourselves as a security service. In this state, that requires a license. If you are operating without one, that is a criminal offense. So I will ask you again, what are your license numbers? The two men exchanged a panicked look. They didn't have licenses. They were just two thugs hired by Karen's brother-in-law. Their silence was a confession. The MP made a note on his pad. Finally, the colonel addressed Karen again. Ma'am, I am ordering you and your unlicensed, uninsured, and illegitimate security force to vacate this veteran's property immediately. You will remove yourselves from the premises and cease all forms of contact, direct or indirect, with Sergeant Rylander. Is that understood? Karen, her face a mottled mask of fury and humiliation, found her voice. You can't do this. This is an HOA matter. You have no jurisdiction here. It was a last desperate gasp of defiance, and it was a fatal mistake. The colonel's patience, thin as it was, snapped. Jurisdiction? He said, his voice a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine even through the closed door. My jurisdiction is the welfare of my soldiers, active and retired. When a civilian mob, led by a petty tyrant, threatens one of my own and attempts to desecrate the flag he fought for, it becomes my jurisdiction. You have created a hostile environment that threatens the peace and security of a former serviceman. That makes it my business. Now get off his property before I have my MPs detain you for harassment and conspiracy to violate civil rights." The word detain hung in the air like a guillotine. The fantasy of power that Karen had built for herself shattered into a million pieces. Her face crumpled. The two goons didn't wait for a second invitation. They practically sprinted back to their unmarked sedan and peeled out of the cul-de-sac, leaving their employer standing alone on my lawn. The deputy, seeing his role in this fiasco was over, tipped his hat to the colonel. "Sir, I think my presence is no longer required here." "You are correct, deputy," the colonel said. "Thank you for your time." With a final withering look at Karen, the colonel turned and walked to my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened it. We stood there for a moment, two soldiers from different eras, bound by a common code. "You all right, Sergeant?" he asked. "Never better, sir," I replied, a slow grin spreading across my face. He nodded toward the street, where Karen was now shuffling back to her golf cart in a daze, the object of dozens of staring eyes and recording phones. "I don't think she'll be bothering you again," he said. He was right. This wasn't just a defeat for Karen. It was a public execution. Her authority hadn't just been challenged. It had been utterly annihilated by a power so far beyond her comprehension that she couldn't even process it. The foundation of fear and intimidation she had so carefully constructed had been bulldozed in less than 10 minutes. The colonel gave me a crisp nod. "You let me know if there are any more problems, Rylander." He and his MPs got back in their vehicles and drove away as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind a stunned silence and the sweet, sweet smell of victory. The siege was over. The war was won. Now it was time for the cleanup. In the immediate aftermath of Karen's public implosion, the neighborhood felt like a country that had just been liberated. People emerged from their homes, not with fear, but with a newfound sense of boldness. The phones that had been recording the confrontation now facilitated a flurry of texts and calls. An impromptu neighborhood meeting was held that very evening in the Garcia's backyard, the once feared blue plastic slide now a symbol of defiance. The mood was celebratory, electric. My lawyer, Tom, had been on the phone with me the moment the MPs left. "Mark, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he said, laughing. "You couldn't have scripted it better. She's finished. Now we salt the earth." The lawsuit we filed the next morning was a masterpiece of legal devastation. It named the HOA, Karen Miller personally, and the sham security company, Prestige Neighborhood Solutions, as defendants. The complaint was over 100 pages long, detailing every instance of harassment, every illegal fine, and every procedural violation. We attached sworn affidavits from a dozen other homeowners, including Mrs. Gable and the Garcias. We included Dave's meticulous research into the financial self-dealing, complete with corporate filings linking the security company to Karen's brother-in-law. We cited the violation of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, which opened the door to federal court. And for good measure, we added counts of conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a RICO claim, arguing that the HOA under her leadership was operating as a criminal enterprise. The report filed by Colonel Peterson's MPs was the cherry on top. It was an official military document detailing an investigation into civilian harassment of a veteran. It described the unlicensed security, the trespassing, and Karen's open defiance of federal law. Tom made sure a copy was attached as Exhibit A to our lawsuit. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for Karen. The HOA's insurance carrier took one look at the lawsuit and the MP report and dropped their coverage, issuing a reservation of rights letter that basically said, "You're on your own." This meant Karen and the other board members were now personally liable for any judgment. Panic set in. The other board members, who had been her loyal rubber stamps, suddenly developed a conscience and a desperate sense of self-preservation. They called for an emergency meeting, the official purpose of which was to discuss the lawsuit. The unofficial purpose was to throw Karen to the wolves. I attended the meeting, held in the community clubhouse. This time I wasn't a pariah, I was a conquering hero. I walked in with Tom by my side, and the room fell silent. Karen was there, sitting at the head of the table, but she looked like a shadow of her former self. Her face was pale and puffy, her eyes darting around the room, finding no friendly faces. The meeting was short and brutal. One by one, her former allies on the board turned on her. They claimed they had been misled, that they had no idea about the financial arrangements with her brother-in-law, that they had trusted her judgment. It was a pathetic display of cowardice, but it was effective. A motion was made for a vote of no confidence in her immediate removal as president. It passed unanimously. She was stripped of her power in the same room where she had wielded it like a weapon. But her problems were just beginning. The local news got wind of the story. A decorated veteran, a tyrannical HOA president, and the dramatic intervention of the U.S. Army. A reporter showed up and started interviewing the neighbors, who were more than happy to share their stories of gnome-related threats and slide-based extortion. The story went viral overnight. On top of the civil lawsuit, the district attorney's office, prompted by the news reports and a polite but firm inquiry from a U.S. congressman who happened to be on the House Armed Services Committee, a contact of Colonel Peterson's, opened a criminal investigation into fraud and embezzlement. Karen's little kingdom had not only fallen, it was now a smoldering radioactive crater. She had tried to take my home, my peace of mind, and my flag. In the end, she lost everything: her power, her reputation, and soon her freedom. We had not just won, we had achieved total victory. The final nail in her coffin was a quiet, almost anticlimactic affair. It was the deposition for our civil suit. Karen sat across a polished mahogany table from Tom and me. Without the armor of her clipboard and her imagined authority, she was just a sad, bitter woman. Tom walked her through every piece of evidence: the letters, the videos, the financial records, the MP report. Her denials grew weaker and weaker until she finally broke down, a torrent of self-pitying sobs and accusations that everyone was out to get her. It was a pathetic end to a pathetic reign. We settled the lawsuit out of court. The terms were harsh. The HOA's remaining funds were used to pay a substantial settlement to be divided among all the homeowners who had been illegally fined. Karen was forced to sign a legally binding agreement never to hold a position on any HOA board again, and to issue a public, written apology to the entire community. The most satisfying part for me was the personal judgment against her. To pay it, she had to sell her house, the very house from which she had terrorized her neighbors. The moving vans arrived a month later, a final public symbol of her complete and utter defeat. With Karen gone and the old board resigning in disgrace, the neighborhood had a chance to start over. We held a special election to form a new HOA board, and this time, the turnout was nearly 100%. The community that Karen had tried to divide through fear and intimidation had been forged into a cohesive, vigilant body by the fight against her. Dave, our data wizard, was unanimously elected treasurer with a mandate to make the HOA's finances completely transparent. The Garcias took on roles in the Architectural Review Committee, promising to apply common sense rather than draconian aesthetic rules. And in a move that brought a tear to my eye, Mrs. Gable was elected president. Her first official act as president was to propose an amendment to the bylaws, which she cheekily named the Garden Gnome Freedom Act, permanently rescinding all regulations on personal yard decorations. It passed with a thunderous chorus of ayes. The atmosphere in the cul-de-sac changed overnight. The low hum of anxiety was replaced by the sound of kids playing, neighbors chatting over fences, and the freedom of people living their lives without fear of getting a violation notice for a non-compliant welcome mat. The community clubhouse, once the site of Karen's kangaroo court, now hosted potluck dinners and holiday parties. The sense of community, which Karen had claimed to be protecting, was finally genuinely being built. We rewrote the HOA rulebook from the ground up. We kept the basic rules that maintained property values and ensured safety, but we stripped out all the subjective, petty regulations that had been used as weapons. The new guiding principle was simple: live and let live. My own life returned to the peaceful rhythm I had sought when I first moved in. The security cameras came down. The thick binder of evidence was filed away in a box in the attic, a relic of a war that had been won. My morning ritual of raising the flag took on a new meaning. It was no longer an act of defiance, but a quiet celebration of the simple freedoms we had fought so hard to reclaim. Colonel Peterson came by one Saturday afternoon, not in uniform, but in a polo shirt and jeans. I had a cold beer waiting for him. We sat on my back patio, watching the smoke curl up from the grill. "Looks like peace has been restored to the sector, Sergeant," he said with a wry smile. "Thanks to you, sir," I replied. "You brought a tank to a knife fight." He shook his head. "I didn't do anything you hadn't already done, Mark. You did the hard work. You gathered the intelligence. You built the coalition. You held the line under fire. I just provided a little fire support at the decisive moment. That's how battles are won." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, a silence that was only broken by the distant laughter of the Garcia kids playing in their yard, the bright blue slide standing proudly in the sun. I looked around at the quiet street, the well-kept lawns, the neighbors who now waved and smiled freely. We had faced down a tyrant, not in some faraway desert, but right here, in our own front yards. The principles I had defended for 20 years in uniform, the rule of law over the rule of bullies, the rights of the individual against the whims of the powerful, the importance of standing together against injustice, turned out to be just as vital here at home. The victory wasn't just about a flagpole or garden gnomes. It was about reminding ourselves that we, the people, are the ultimate authority. We grant power to those who govern us, whether it's in Washington, D.C., or in a suburban HOA, and we have the right and the responsibility to take it back when it's abused. My quiet patch of green was finally my sanctuary, made all the more peaceful by the battle it took to secure it. And every morning, as the flag climbed to the top of its pole, it served as a reminder that sometimes the most important ground to defend is the ground right under your own feet. The story could have ended there, with the barbecue and the quiet victory, but justice, I've found, often has a final, ironic postscript. About 6 months after Karen sold her house and vanished from our lives, I got a call from Tom, my lawyer. He was laughing so hard he could barely speak. "Mark," he wheezed, "you are not going to believe this. You have to see this." He sent me a link to a news article from a small town about 200 miles away. The headline read, "New Homeowners Association President Vows to Clean Up Community, Faces Backlash." I clicked the link and there she was. A grainy photo showed Karen Miller standing in front of a different community clubhouse, pointing an accusatory finger at something just off camera. She had moved, joined another HOA, and like a moth to a flame, had gotten herself elected president again. The article detailed how she had immediately tried to implement a series of draconian new rules, including banning children's bicycles from being left on driveways and mandating a specific brand of mailbox. The residents were already forming a concerned homeowners group to oppose her. It was incredible. She was so fundamentally wired for conflict, so addicted to control, that she couldn't help but repeat the same pattern of self-destruction. She had learned absolutely nothing. Tom's call wasn't just for a good laugh, though. The lawyer for this new group of homeowners found the articles about what happened here, he explained. He called me for information. I'm sending him a copy of our entire case file as a professional courtesy. The lawsuit, the depositions, the MP report, all of it. A slow, satisfied smile spread across my face. We hadn't just defeated her. We had created a permanent record of her tyranny. We had, in effect, created a vaccine. Her reputation would now precede her wherever she went. Any community she tried to infect with her brand of toxic leadership would now have access to the playbook on how to stop her. She was no longer just Karen Miller. She was a case study in how not to run an HOA. This final piece of news cemented the legacy of our little suburban rebellion. It showed that standing up to a bully has ripple effects you can't always see. Our fight had not only liberated our own community, but had also armed another one, and potentially many more after that. It underscored the importance of creating a public record, of exposing wrongdoing not just for your own sake, but for the sake of those who might come after. The true restoration of our neighborhood wasn't just in the removal of a bad leader, it was in the empowerment of the residents. We were more than just a collection of houses on a street. We were a community, bound by a shared experience and a shared commitment to protecting our peace. The HOA meetings, once dreaded events, were now well attended and productive. We worked together on community improvement projects, we organized neighborhood watch programs, and we looked out for each other. Mrs. Gable, in her infinite wisdom, proved to be the finest president the association had ever had. Her leadership was based on listening, compassion, and a healthy respect for her neighbor's right to be left alone. Her garden gnome collection, once a symbol of her persecution, was now a beloved neighborhood landmark. She even added a new gnome, one she painted to look like a little soldier, and placed it right at the front of her garden. She told me it was there to stand guard. Thinking about it all now, the whole ordeal feels like a microcosm of a larger truth. The world is full of Karens, people who crave power and use rules not to create order, but to exert control. They thrive in the shadows of apathy, counting on good people to be too busy or too intimidated to fight back. But when those people decide they've had enough, when they find the courage to stand together, to document the truth, and to hold the line, those little empires of petty tyranny crumble to dust. My life is quiet now, just as I always wanted. I have my garden, my Mustang, and my peace. But it's a peace I appreciate more deeply, because I know it's not a given. It has to be guarded. Every morning when I step onto my porch and clip the flag to the halyard, I look out at the quiet cul-de-sac, at the houses of my friends and neighbors, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude. We fought a ridiculous, stressful, and ultimately necessary war, and we won. The flag rises, catches the wind, and flies free. And so do we.